class. This is going to be the IPE recording for this week. I'm going to start with a discussion of the paper submission. So for the paper submission, you want it to be double spaced. You need 12-point font. You want it to be Times New Roman, very standard. For the header information, there's a little confusion. I want you to provide the title, and then I want you to just go into the paper. I don't want you to provide your name or the course number or the date. None of that is really relevant, and I know my name, you know your name. I don't need to have that information, so it becomes filler. The problem with filler is that when I see it, you're just adding material to extend the length, but what it doesn't do is providing information, which actually damages your grade, right? So I know when I'm using filler and I pull that out, right? I'm like, okay, this is just filler. Now, examples of filler is you write the full name of the article in the paper, you have multiple subtitles, or you have page breaks, right? You're extending the length of the paper, but you're not extending the material and the content of the paper. I can tell when you're doing that, and it damages your grade, right? So don't do those things. When you're writing, right, when you add the full name of the article, that doesn't actually give me any information. All that does is provide the name of the article. And because you're using citations, you don't need any of that. Give me the arguments in your own words, right? No quotes. Just discuss it in your own words, and then you say, okay, well, I got this information, right? This is what I got from this article, and then cite it, at the end, right? Use in-text citation. So you're just going to say, here's an argument that I am discussing right now, whatever that argument may be. And then at the end, you're going to use an in-text citation. So the in-text citation is just at the end of the sentence, parentheses, author, comma, year, in parentheses, period, right? That's the in-text citation. And then you need a works cited. So anything that you do an in-text citation for, it needs to be in your works cited. And anything in your works cited needs to have an in-text citation somewhere in the paper, right? Don't provide me this long works cited and none of it's in your paper. A good rule of thumb is every paragraph should have a citation. In every paragraph, you need information that's not common knowledge, or else why are we discussing it in this paper? So you want information that is not common knowledge, and because you want information that is not common knowledge, you got it from some source, so you want to cite that source in every paragraph. And if you have a citation in every paragraph and you're really getting into the information, right, and making an argument based on what you have pulled from these authors, you should have a good paper and a good grade on that paper. It is due today. Don't stress about it. Turn it in. Make sure you put in the effort. I recognize effort. If you're still having a problem, I know I got a lot of emails. That's why I'm doing this instead of responding individually, right? Work with me through this process. A lot of you submitted early, and your submissions that were early asked for resubmissions, and your resubmissions were much better. So I will work with people. You just can't turn it in late and then ask for a resubmission. If you don't turn it in today, there's no way that I'm going to allow you to sort of make edits. So make sure you turn in a full paper today. Right? That's the only way to fail this class is to not turn in a paper. So make sure you turn in a paper, a full paper, right? With the sources and the articles, put in the work. For this week, we're only going to be covering the readings of Susan Strange and the first chapter of the Phillips and Weaver text. So these are the only two articles we're going to cover in the lecture. If you read any other articles that were listed in the syllabus or other chapters of the book, there'll be an extra credit opportunity at the end. So we're going to talk about IPE. IPE is International Political Economy. And an international political economy often deals with things that are currency evaluation or trade, right, or just the GDP, any other version of the economy that has some sort of political science impact. And we'll talk about this as we go through Susan Strange, because what is IPE and what does it mean? What's the difference between international relations and IPE, right? Why are the subfields different? Why is this a subfield? We're going to talk about, and Susan Strange makes very clear. So Susan Strange starts with this idea of that it's sort of this case of mutual neglect, right? You have the international economy accelerating, and economists are seeing all of this connectivity, this globalization, right? Markets are trading at a very high level. Economies are becoming interconnected, right? You have multinational corporations coming in and producing in all these countries, and it's only assembled in the US, and it's called made in the US, right? So you have all these factors going. The international political system is still very divided. States still have borders, they have their own governments, there is very little political integration. So a lot of scholars assume that political systems would catch up. But Susan Strange says, well, why would we expect them to catch up? The next part is this idea of how these changes are impacting political science. The first part is a disturbance effect. A disturbance effect is where something happens in the global market and it impacts the national economy. If you see a surplus rice crop in China, China will often export a lot of rice, right? It can't have all of that rice go to domestic consumption, so it exports more rice. And because it's a very large producer of that product, a lot of that gets into other countries, which devalues the rice in that country, right? That's why there are anti-dumping laws, which we'll talk about in a second. So you can have a global shock impact your economy, even if your economy wasn't really affected by this. In the recession, right, in 2008, you had this global recession that was triggered by the advanced economies of the world doing a lot of things with economic tools, right? You had credit default swaps, you had all of these loans going out. These were happening in the sort of Western world, and then their economies slowed down because of these economic tools, but they have nothing to do with growing, products, coconuts and bananas and coffee in these sort of underdeveloped countries. But because the Western economies had a recession, they're buying less products and they're spending less money on raw goods like iron and bauxite. And because they're not buying this iron and bauxite, all of a sudden something that was the result of speculation in the Western world is now impacting the underdeveloped communities who are selling raw goods because they're not able to sell as many of those goods. So even though you have a economy that is separate, right, these global shocks can impact them. So you're vulnerable, and we call them disturbance effects. The next part is hindrance effects. So if you're a small country and you see this coming, right, which a lot of these small countries in 2009, they saw, okay, the international system is making some mistakes with their economic tools, they're going to have this recession, let's sort of insulate ourselves. Well, how do you insulate yourself as a state if your policies don't really change the global market? Right? You might institute a policy that you don't, right? If you're Ghana and you say we're not going to allow for credit default swaps in Ghana, that's our national policy, that doesn't really change the behavior in the national community. If you don't want to see gold change hands for a period of time, so you say, oh, we're not going to let you sell gold or currency in our economy, well, people are doing this digitally now. So this economic exchange can't be stopped by a national policy. So countries and states no longer have the ability to control their economy at the level that they used to because of this increased interconnected exchange. The last part is a competitive effect, and we saw this World War I was a very high level of use. And what a state would do is they would intentionally take a policy that damaged another state, right? And when we talk about China, right, China knows that it has too much rice, and it knows that by dumping a lot of rice into the market, right, that's right, we have anti-dumping laws, it's going to flood this into the market and it's going to decrease the entire economy. So the US might say, okay, we have anti-dumping laws, you can't dump in the US. So China says, well, I'll go to Thailand and I'll go to Korea and I'll go to Vietnam and I'll dump rice there. And the global, right, all of the other states will have a damaged valuation of their rice, right? So if you're a rice farmer and all of a sudden the value of your rice goes down dramatically, you can't sell your rice at a value that you can even live off of, right? That's your only way of making income. And all of a sudden rice has almost no value. So these are competitive effects, right? You can damage other states. The same thing happens, coffee is very weird. Ethiopia and Colombia are high-level coffee producers, right? They're very well known for producing very high-quality coffee. But the more that one creates, the more that one state creates, the more it damages the price of another state. We know that OPEC, the oil-producing countries, right, they've all come to an agreement specifically because of this. Because if one country is overproducing, it devalues all of these countries. So when you have coffee producers, they're not aligned in a very clear way. So a lot of times one will overproduce and it will damage the production value of the others. Now, you can have a cooperative or defensive response to this. A cooperative response is where you try to build an organization, right? Most of the world has gone to a cooperative response. We know this because of the World Trade Organization. If a country dumps a lot of a product in your state, you can go to the WTO and you can agree to this arbitration and say, okay, this seems like they're dumping in my country at a high level, and you can have scholars and sort of these judges are very high level economic scholars, and they can figure out how would be appropriate to respond to this, right? So you have states agreeing, okay, we have a trade organization, we need to set up some of these. The other part is a defensive response. Now, the EU, in part, is a defensive response. You have a customs union, right? We look at Brexit. So the UK is leaving the EU. One of the big problems is that now the goods coming out of the European continent are going to be at a higher price for the British, and the British goods going in will be bought at a less value, right? Whenever you have a customs union, things become more costly to come in and out. And so you don't want to buy, right? If you were in France, you don't want to buy anything from Britain because it's going to be at a higher price. It's not a better product, it's just a higher price because it's going through that customs union. So customs union or defensive response, like any goods coming in and out of this are going to be at a higher cost because we're going to add some sort of import tax or a levy or a tariff or a fee. The other part is the case of Zimbabwe. A couple of sub-Saharan African countries have done a few things like this. They might ban foreign currency, right? A lot of their population in Zimbabwe didn't trust the Zimbabwe currency. At one point, right, as you read, right, the Zimbabwe dollar was 34 quadrillion to 1. So you'd have to have billions and billions of dollars in Zimbabwe dollars, essentially, to get one American dollar. And because the exchange rate's so bad, you couldn't buy anything with the money that you were paid, right? If your salary is eight Zimbabwe dollars an hour and it's not worth anything to the people who are exchanging that money, right? You don't want to use that money. So this is a really good example of a defensive response. So they ban foreign currency, they don't allow as many imports, but at the same time, right, it's not really effective because if you ban foreign currency and you say everyone has to do an international currency, because of digital exchanges, you can exchange in Bitcoin, you can exchange in dollars over your mobile phone, you can do a digital exchange, you can just do Zelle or any other of the products that banks now provide. So it's very, very difficult for some of these defensive responses when it comes to currency. So political science is not really responding to these changes, right? A lot of this has been left to the economists. So this leads us to our next question. Why not leave it to the economists? They are economists, right? They study economics, they know a lot about this. So the biggest reason that we always point to is this over-reliance on quantitative data and models. One of the biggest critiques that we know exists of economists is if a model doesn't exist to explain it, then it doesn't exist to an economist, right? And I don't mean they don't deal with it, they just don't see it as an issue. If you can't put a model to it, it will not be something discussed by economists. And humans and political behavior is often very sort of wild and sort of uncontrollable. And so giving everything a model is very, very difficult, but we need these models for some problems, and we need to be able to address all problems. A political scientist can't say, oh, that's not a problem of political science. All problems are political science problems. Whereas an economist can say that's not an economics problem, right? An economist can walk away from it, a political science cannot. The next part is that economists are politically naive. They will often say things that if states just had the willpower to do it the right way, then everything would be fine, right? This is often a commentary in the past, not in the last 10 years, but an economist would say this is the right way, why don't you just do it the right way? And they would say you don't have the will to do it the right way, right? When in reality, if you're an elected official, you have a lot of things going on. It's not just economics. There are a lot of other factors that exist. So you can't just take the most economically sound position because you're worried about getting reelected. You're worried about poor people, right? Poor people is a problem for economics, right? That poor people don't really fit an economics model. They're like, oh, everyone works and everyone makes money, and so therefore they're going to behave that way. Well, what about the people who don't work? Well, they're not included, right? You can't do that as a political scientist. Everyone is involved in political science. So this behavior, this politically naive behavior doesn't really fit. And the last part is an over-reliance on rational choice. You all know that I am a big proponent of rational choice. I think that we can sort of weigh the costs and benefits. But not all human behavior will follow a rational choice model. So one is that humans can at times not follow a clear rational choice model, and we've talked about how rational choice models are often sort of oversimplified. But the other part is that in economics, all humans are interchangeable. You can just replace one with another, right? Individual X is the same as individual Y. Well, we know that's not really true in political science, right? That Americans are treated very differently based on race, on religion. So if you're saying, oh, we need 100 workers for this factory, what type of people are you going to get, right? There are other factors. It's not just 100 people. Those 100 people are much more likely, especially we're talking about factory workers in the S, to be minorities, right? That minorities typically end up in a lot of these low-skilled jobs for a lot of different reasons, but we know that that's not exchangeable, right? You can't replace one with the other. And if you're in places like Texas or you're in Arizona, there are a lot of biases that companies don't want to hire certain minorities, right? Or if you're in Michigan or if you're in the East Coast, right, there's a lot of bias against minorities, so they're not going to be hired in certain jobs. So political scientists have to recognize those factors, whereas economists just treat all individuals as interchangeable. So how does this damage IPE? The first is that there's almost no real-world policy making. IR scholars don't deal in economic policy, right? And so economists don't deal with people. So you just don't see this policy making. So what one of the issues that's historically we know about is the European Economic Community, which is a precursor to the EU, which is the economic portion before the EU becomes this larger political body, is that no one talked about this point of no return. Once the euro, right, the euro dollar, the euro, the currency of the EU, right, which becomes these currency states, once it gets introduced and exchanged at a high rate, it becomes the primary currency. So if your Greece, right? Greece ran into this problem. If your primary currency, the currency that people trust the most is the euro, and then something happens to the euro, you can't really do anything nationally. You're beyond a point of no return, right? You are now no longer capable of reversing integration, right? And I don't mean racial integration, right? This is economic integration. I keep getting off track. So if you're Greek and economically you're integrating and all of a sudden you don't really want to be part of the euro, it's too late. Your country, your state, the Greek state cannot remove itself from this eurozone, right? Whereas the British could remove themselves from the eurozone. They weren't past the point of no return. But scholars were not discussing this point of no return. So states didn't know when they were hitting it, and there was no discussion of a point of no return. And because of that, not that lack of discussion, international relations and specifically political science scholars were not able to find this point of no return and inform, right, the states and the governments that were dealing with this issue. The other part is this idea of multinational corporations. So multinational corporations, they do international production, which I've talked about. You have the carburetor made in Taiwan, and you have the tires made in Brazil, and these are just random. I'm not really assigning any countries any production capabilities. And you have a piece of a car built in all of these different countries, and then you ship all of the pieces of those cars to the United States, and then some factory in the United States puts all the pieces together, and then that car is made in the United States, right? Even though it's built everywhere else and just put together in the US, you can put a made in the US stamp on that car because it was assembled in the US. So if you're having all this international production, then these multinational corporations, they don't have to respond in the same way that a state has to. And the biggest issue is that now these multinational corporations are going to be able to produce more than most states. And I'm going to use the example of Walmart in Spain. So Walmart is the 10th largest body in the world. Walmart is bigger than Spain. The yearly or whatever, at some point in time, right, depending on how we talk about this, the yearly exchanges of Walmart exceeds that of Spain. Now, whether we talk about like imports, how are we measuring this? What matters is that even though states are still the largest bodies, right, the way that we're measuring them, multinational corporations are rivaling many of these states. And because they're producing in multiple countries, right, it breaks some of the systems that we expect, and the states don't have as much leverage with these multinational corporations. Multinational corporations can really control the behavior of some of these. And this leads to what we call extra governmental rules. So a lot of the international markets have no rules. And the only reason why they have sort of customs and habits is because the people who trade in those want some rules. If you're a bondsman, a bond trader, and you want to deal in bonds from the Eurozone or Chinese government bonds or American savings bonds, right, and you're exchanging them internationally, you want some rules exist. So they're making their own rules without state involvement. And we know this is very clear that the state has very little control of this. It was made very clear in the United States by Facebook. So Facebook was called upon by Senate, right? There was a Senate hearing. They wanted to talk to the CEO, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. And the first part was it was made very clear that states don't really know how these companies are functioning, right? You had a senator ask Facebook how it was making money without charging its users a fee, right? It ran off of ads, right? A very clear problem that Congress doesn't know how Facebook is making money. And then later on, it became very clear that Congress has no idea how to stop Facebook from interfering with its population, right? Facebook is feeding information to a population, and Congress and most governments cannot control it, right? You have the Chinese government sort of trying to block sites, but a lot of the Chinese population is able to bypass the security, right, and find other ways to avoid those subjects. So when we're talking about this, right, we have to realize that IPE has to care about this because right now the markets are making their own rules. And if their markets are making their own rules, they're not concerned about the cost of the population. They're not concerned about environmental degradation. They're not concerned about long-term costs. They're concerned about wealth evaluation. Are they making money, right? Companies and exchanges are dealing with profits. Governments don't just have profits as their only motivator. They have to deal with a lot of other factors. So because of that, right, we have to discuss those issues. Right. This means that we have some required economic knowledge, right? That political scientists need to have some understanding of economic knowledge. The first is economic theory concepts and methods. So some of this we've already talked about. Rational choice, right? Economists typically treat people as rational. And we'll talk about that in a second, right? That you are considered rational and you're going to consider to do cost-benefit analysis on your behavior. Formal modeling. So I'm going to do a formal model later, but formal modeling just means that under certain conditions, individual acts should behave in a certain way, right? This is the problem that human interchangeability, right? That doesn't matter who it is, that person has preferences, and we put them under certain conditions, and they're going to behave in a certain way. And then the last is statistics, right? Statistics is going to matter if you're a political science major, but if you're in other fields, statistics really sort of predict human behavior, but only sort of for the average interchangeable citizen, right? There are always variation, but statistics give us sort of a correlation between what is happening, right? The cause and effect of what is occurring. So these are three concepts, methods that are necessary. We also need to start engaging in these economic institutions exchanges. So within the UN is a committee called ECOSOC, it's the Economics and Social Committee, and they combine these things. They say, here are some social issues, here are some economic issues, let's try and find some political solutions, right? So in the UN, there's this issue. We've already talked about the WTO. The WTO has a court system, right, for lack of a better term, right? It has a court system in which it decides some of the things. It has an arbitration where it says, okay, your trade deal between Venezuela and Brazil is under this is acceptable because it meets sort of equitable issues, right? Is it fair to both states? And that determination. And then currency exchange. Currency exchange is a very large and very lucrative part of the international system. If political scientists don't recognize that some currency is being traded, not just because you want American dollars, which are more stable than Zimbabwe dollars, but also because you want American dollars to then trade for Chinese yuan, to then trade for, right, some Russian currency, and then make money that way by the changing of their values, right? I know that the Chinese yuan is going to go up in value tomorrow. So I take my dollars and I change them into yuan, and then it goes up in value, and I change them back into dollars, and I've made money because of the change in the value of that currency. So that market itself has to be studied because people are making those arguments, and we need to address them politically. They're already being addressed economically. And then the last is economic history. And this is what we're talking about, a case study where you're just discussing like what was the economic history of Brazil, what was the economic history of the UK, and then process tracing, right, which is something we talked about. Here, we know the biggest change is that the European Economic Commission, the EEC, the predecessor to the EU, agreed to have a euro. So process tracing is you say, okay, at this point in time, these states agreed to use a common currency, the euro. Because they agreed to that, all of a sudden their economic policies had to start aligning, right? That's process tracing. This decision led to actions in the future. So economic history is very informative. It is not something that we do a lot of today, but it was very informative to sort of this baseline of how did these things come about? How does the EU come about? Process tracing. Interdependence leads to, right, interconnected economies, leads to a shared currency, leads to political integration. That's process tracing. So Strange says, right, Susan Strange says that this means we need a new generation of bridge builders. You guys, right, that you need to understand both the economics and the political science, and you need to be integrating these two ideas, right? You need to be combining these ideas. Okay, that's the end of Susan Strange's, and now we're going to go into Phillips and Weaver. This is going to be a little longer of a video. I apologize, but hopefully it will cover everything that we expect. So the next part is that Phillips and Weaver are talking about an American school of IPE. Now, IPE is broken into two schools, the American school and the British school. The American school is positivist and empirical, and we'll talk about what both of those mean in a second. The British school is normative and imperative. So what you see in the British school that you don't see in the American school is that the British will include a lot of should and ought, right? These are things should be this way. These are the way, right, we think that everyone has a right to life and a right to certain income level. So we're going to bring these normative interpolations in our research. The American school does not. The American school is very, very formal. It's about positive things, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then Cohen in 2007 makes his argument that two schools are increasingly fractured, right? The British school of IPE and the American school of IPE, they don't really talk to each other. So we're going to talk about that next week. For now, let's just talk about what is the American school, and let's do it in a very formal way, in the way that the American school would do. So the American school is positivist. That means any rational assertion can be scientifically verified. If you say something, it can be tested, and the testing is what matters, right? The next thing is empiricism. So empiricism comes from this objective ontology, right? We have a real world, it is measurable, it exists. And because the world is measurable and exists, right, we can take certain things and we can see how much they're worth, right? I can look at how many tons of coal were exported. I can look at the total size of the economy. These are all measurable things. And this leads to what we call formal models, right? And I'm going to describe to you a formal model right now in a very, very simplistic fashion. If the price of apples increases and oranges decreases, then individual X will buy oranges instead of apples. Any person, right? Individual X could be any human on the planet. If oranges are cheaper, you're going to buy oranges instead of apples, right? Because your preferences can be quantified. Your value, right? Let's say you enjoy apples more than you enjoy oranges. So if your value, if you say, okay, an apple is a 2 and an orange is a 1, right? That I get 2 points of value from an apple and 1 point of value from an orange. But if the price of an apple is $10 and the price of an orange is 10 cents, then you're still going to get an orange because you're getting more for how much you're paying. It's value divided by cost. So this is a formal model. It seems very simplistic, right? It seems just like shopping, but this is a formal model in sort of basic, most simplest form, right? If the price of something changes, your desire to buy it will change, right? And we call this, right? This is basic supply and demand. We won't really get into that in this course, right? But it's very clear that some of you would not do that, right? I hate apples, right? I hate apples. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much apples are, how much oranges are. I don't eat apples for a multitude of reasons. It doesn't matter the price of an apple. I'm always going to go for an orange, right? So not all of this can be explained. The American school is buying into this formal modeling, right? Even though that's the problem that Susan Strange was worried about, the American school has bought into the economics model, and that's an issue that they face. So the methods of this chapter follow a couple of other things, right? The first is, right, when we're talking about Phillips and Weaver chapter 1, they look at a pattern of publication method. So they're going to look at what articles were published in the top 12 journals. So they take the top 12 valued, peer-reviewed political science journals, and they say what is being published in those. And what they notice, it is dominated by American authors, and they mean authors at American institutions, because even though they're American authors, many of these authors are international. And I don't really mean that like they travel internationally. You are an American author even if you are from Kenya or Zimbabwe or Spain or Venezuela or Russia if you come and work in an American institution. Because of the way the American system works, it doesn't matter your nationality or your race. If you're a professor at an American institution, you're an American author, right? So it's kind of a weird diagnosis, but even people from the UK, if they come here and they work at our institutions and they get a degree from our programs, they're considered American authors. So it's one of the weird things about American IPE is your background as a person doesn't really matter. You become an American author when you work in an American institution. And we know that's problematic, but that's how we judge that. And then we see that in these top journals, we're going to see a lot of behavior. The other thing is we're going to talk about demography, right? What is the race and the sex and the age of all of these scholars? And we know that IPE scholars are trained at different schools. So you have some schools that have a dual degree field. So you can get an economics and a political science combined degree. There are very few schools that do that. And then IPE scholars, instead of taking 4 or 5 years, they take 6 or 7 years to get their PhD. So normally, at a high level, it's sort of Ivy League, it's 4 years. And then IPE scholars are taking, even at these Ivy Leagues, are taking a little longer. But once they're done, they're more likely to get hired. So there's a difference in the demography of IPE scholars, not really in sex or race, right? That political science academia doesn't really care about your like race, religion, sex, any of those things. Hiring practices are pretty much done in publication. So IP scholars, it doesn't matter what race or sex they are, it matters that they are getting published more before they graduate, and then they're more likely to get hired. So it is a little bit more meritocracy. There's other stuff at play, but in IPE is a little bit more of a meritocracy than other fields. So we're looking at journal publications. We're talking about specifically those that are found in IO, which is called International Organizations to Journal. International Studies Quarterly is a journal, and World Politics a journal. So these are major IPE journals. They have a lot of the bigger IPE articles. So these 3 factors, we're looking at publications to determine if the American IPE school, what it is, and how it is different from other things. The first thing that we notice is that IPE is paradigmatic, right? Anytime you see an IPE article, it's going to typically have a paradigm foundation. And by paradigm, I mean realism, liberalism, Marxism, and constructivism. Now, we know we didn't cover Marxism as much, but it's because it doesn't really have a prominent place in the 21st century, right? You don't have as many Marxist scholars. We still talk about it a lot, but it didn't really show up as much after sort of 1989, and it's not really something that you're going to discuss from your theoretical foundings. Right? Realism, liberalism, and constructivism are still the dominant paradigms that exist. Now, in IPE, right, liberalism has been dominating since the 1980s, and realism and constructivism haven't really pushed in yet. So why do we still talk about realism? Because it's sort of the point by which to be critiqued, right? As we talked about this early in the course, I'm going to give you realism, and then I'm going to give you all of these other theories. Realism is very clear. So the pedagogy, the teaching of it is very easy. So I teach you realism, and then when we look at liberalism, we can have sort of a contrast, right? And it's easier for you to understand liberalism because it is not realism. So you understand liberalism better. Liberalism takes off because it does a better job of explaining. You can predict economic exchange better with liberalism. Now, the problem with that is that any work is based in that liberalism has to follow that theory in every aspect. So if you're saying, okay, this is a liberalism dominant field, that means liberalist ideas are dominating those fields, right? A lot of these other things that exist, right? The intrinsic value of people, right? This idea that norms matter, right? All of these things impact the field, and you don't have atheoretic work, right? And you don't really see atheoretic work. Atheoretic work is where you just sort of go about the problem and you don't really follow a theory. You just say, let's just look at the problem. It's very rare in IPE that you're not basing behavior on some theory. Now, we talked about this, right? There's rational choice, and there's all of these assumptions and models for humans in that. So it needs some theory to drive how humans would behave. So because we're very formal in American IPE, we also need a theory to drive it. So IPE as a field is grounded in paradigms. We want to make sure we focus in on that. And as we move forward, we want to make sure that we see, okay, what paradigm are they using to make these arguments, right? What is driving their expectations? All right, so methods in American IPE has been quantitative for some time. Quantitative is different from qualitative, right? Quantitative is anything that you measure and count. Qualitative is things that you sort of like interpret, right? Norms and values are harder to quantify, that you have to interpret them. Process tracing is an interpretive, inductive behavior, whereas quantitative is a little more deductive, right? I'm going to look at the numbers. What are the numbers telling me? They're going to use regression analysis. So regression analysis is something you'll learn in 302. And then also there's this idea of a generational gap, right? You are going to be very used to using statistics because it is required as a political science major. In fact, I think all bachelors require some statistics training today, right? It'd be weird if you didn't get some math and statistics training today, and part of that is because increased computing power. Now, we've had a lot of issues with computer power this semester, but compared to the 1980s, right, doing a regression is very, very easy. Right? It used to take hours and hours for a computer to run a regression in the past. Now it's 10 seconds, if that, right? Probably less than 10 seconds, that you could set up a regression and run it. So you have a generational gap in IPE scholars where older IPE scholars are less likely to use quantitative measures, and younger IPE scholars are much more likely. And it's because of the computer, right? It's very easy to do it. You're going to get clear answers, right? Qualitative work is now harder than quantitative work because regression analysis is so easy with our modern computers and a lot of the software that we've created to make regression easier. So let's take a second and talk about the difference between theory and hypothesis. So a theory is something that deals with a larger concept, right? Realism deals with the entire international system. Okay, what is the international system like? What does it mean for a state? So a theory is very broad. It's this big concept. And some authors have sort of been very bothered that we don't really deal in these larger concepts anymore. What we deal is small problems. What all of you should be doing in your papers, right, and what you'll see as we go through these articles is they're dealing with smaller problems, much, much smaller problems. And that's what a hypothesis is for. A hypothesis is targeted. So an example of a hypothesis would be, do heavily indebted countries invest less in infrastructure? Actually, that's wrong. Let me change this to what a hypothesis would look like. A hypothesis is not a question. And I apologize, I know I'm doing this right in front of you, and hopefully this makes it clear. Right? A hypothesis is something that you believe to be true based on the evidence you've seen, and now you're going to test to see if it's true. So heavily indebted countries invest less in infrastructure, right? That's your hypothesis. Sometimes we would talk about this as a thesis statement, but when it's testable, we would call it a hypothesis. So that's your hypothesis. The theory informs a hypothesis. So if you're thinking, oh, heavily indebted countries, they won't invest in infrastructure. What theory is driving you is realism. So if you're coming from a realist theory, you're saying, okay, well, states are worried about relative gains. And infrastructure doesn't really help with relative gains because you're not producing the economy immediately, right? So what they are investing in is they're going to invest in corporate production, right, rather than infrastructure. So they get a little bit of an advantage over another state, right? Even though infrastructure would help them in the long run, it doesn't give them an immediate relative advantage. So realism is going to say that these indebted countries, why invest in infrastructure when they should be focusing on making more money, right? Or it might be that realism says that these great powers are dominating these indebted countries and making them to accept more debt in the way they're doing exchange, right? That's dependency theory, which we might have a chance to talk about in next week, right? So realism is saying, oh, these states are being forced into that position. So you're going to take this theory and then see the behavior of those states through that theoretical lens and then test that hypothesis, usually with quantitative data. The other part is that IPE often takes a regional focus. So when you're talking about a problem, you're talking about a regional problem. And this happens a lot in IPE. So if you're talking about sub-Saharan Africa or Africa in general, and North Africa is actually included in the Middle East a lot of the time. So if you're talking about Africa, the question is always underdeveloped. Why is Africa not developing? Politically, economically, why is Africa not developing? So if you're doing that region, you're concerned about lack of development. If you're talking about the Middle East, what is most common, right, is you're talking about a resource curse. A resource curse is where they're not developing infrastructure because they have oil, right? So a resource curse is, oh, I have money from this thing I'm producing, so why invest in a corporation or some sort of larger production when I already have oil to fund my economy? So that's called a resource curse because you already have some sort of source of wealth, so you're not investing. But in the long run, right, when the oil runs out or when the oil can't produce enough to keep up with population, you don't have an infrastructure. That's why it's a resource curse. In the long run, it damages you. When we talk about East Asia used to always be about these development success stories. So I introduced this difference between import substitution, industrialization. East Asia was really recognized for that in Korea and in Vietnam and Taiwan. They took a low sort of skilled work product, specifically textiles and fabrics, and they sold that as much as they could, and they invested with that money in cars and other infrastructure and computers and microchips, and then they developed that way. So when we talk about East Asia, a lot of that's about these success stories and how they worked. Now, it should be no surprise that one of the things they did was labor suppression, right? They made their workers work for less, harder for less, and then they sort of drug out as much through their textile companies and then funded other things with those textile profits. But right, that's still the focus in East Asia, right? We see these Asian focuses, these regional focuses, and the regional focuses are tied to certain concepts. It's very normal in IPE. And the last one is China. And China is separated because there are a couple of things that are specific. China has often undervalued its currency on purpose. So I make my currency make it seem like it's not worth as much, and then that allows me to export more goods because the price of buying them is different, right? So currency evaluation can be used as a tool to get more exports out so that you're actually making more money, which is more complicated, and we don't have really time to get into a lot of the currency undervaluation issue in this course. And then the other part is competition with the US. Some people have argued that China would overtake the US economically and sort of become the global power, right? That the US would be in decline and then China would rise. Scholars have really looked at this because if you're an American IPE scholar, part of this is let's look at the numbers and let's see why China is doing better, because you want to solve this problem. You want the American economy to compete with the Chinese economy. And what they realize is that even though China was doing very well, the sort of underpinnings that exist aren't going to allow it to grow larger than the U.S. economy anytime, right? We always thought in the 80s and 90s it was always Japan or that China was going to take over as the global power, and we still see the U.S. having sort of a much larger economy because of some of these underpinnings, right? China is raising a lot of people out of poverty and creating a new working class, and they have over 1 billion people, so they have a larger population, but they don't have consumption. Their population isn't buying like we're buying, and so it's going to take a long time to get to that process. It could be another 40 or 50 years before they're really competing at a global scale. The last part is this idea of an ideational turn. So American IPE still does not include ideational factors. We don't concern about norms and values as much. We are very much in the models, right? All individuals are sort of interchangeable. So the problem is that we still are facing that issue that Susan Strange introduced, that we're still just looking at quantitative, rational, interchangeable humans, and we're just running these models, and we're not really treating these values as having a big impact, right? And American IPE doesn't really fit with the way we responded to conflict diamonds a few years ago. It might be more than a few years ago now. But there are no laws against buying conflict diamonds. There are no laws, right? Very clearly, the United States did not pass a law banning conflict diamonds. What happened is the public chose to only buy conflict-free diamonds. And then the companies that sell diamonds started labeling diamonds that were conflict-free. Now, the validity of it's not very clear, whether or not they're sort of faking some of it, that's not very clear, but the response was ideational. Humans decided that they wanted this label that it was a conflict-free diamond, and they wanted to stop buying diamonds from conflict areas. Now, there's all sorts of other conflict minerals that are involved, right, that we don't really recognize, but that factor was ideational. It wasn't a change in the value of a diamond, it was a change in the norms and values of the people who buy diamonds. And so you don't really have that included as much in a lot of the models, and you haven't had constructivism sort of take over IPE the way that constructivism has become very powerful in the rest of IR and the rest of the political science world. So you don't have this ideational turn in IPE. So that was a quick overview of Susan Strange and Phillips Weaver to get you into IPE, what we're going to be discussing. We're going to do a little more concrete. We're going to do the British School and then an article next week. I want to talk about some specific things, but we will have time next week to discuss that. The last part is the extra credit. So I want you to take either any chapter other than chapter 1 from Phillips and Weaver, or the Katzenstein, Keohane, and Krasner. It's a really good article. It's just a little long, and I don't want you to get bogged down in this for this exam. They will not be included in the exam. So I want you, if you have read this and you're like, well, I read it and now I've read it for nothing, write a critique of it. Or if you haven't read it, right, go through this article, write a critique of it, use 6 sentences, right? I want you to just, very simple, 6 sentences, write a couple sentences showing me that you actually read the article, right? Give me some evidence about it, and then explain in 3 sentences, okay, this is something that doesn't seem logically consistent. This seems like a problem with the article or the chapter. This seems like something that, and not something like, oh, I didn't understand. No, this seems something that is wrong with the article, right? If you're not clear, you can always talk to me about not being clear, but for this extra credit assignment, I want you to point out what is something that you think is wrong. What is something that they say, oh, this is responding to realism, and you're like, that doesn't fit with the realism that I know, right? That realism as a theory doesn't fit with what they're saying, right? Do a critique, try and analyze this, and use that critical thought. All right, thank you.